Hey, it's Concrete. Uh, Another batch of Flavorah beta testing today. I have popcorn, I have graham cracker, and I have their vanilla bean flavor. So I'll flash the neat little disclaimer at the bottom again, but I didn't pay for these. But I figured might as well be helpful and go ahead and go over some of the stuff pre-release. So when it does hit, everybody will at least know what's going on. Um, so starting off, I have their popcorn flavor, and I'm going to start with this one because I feel like this one needs the least sort of context. Okay, so first things first, it does in fact taste like popcorn. Um, it has that kind of like drier popcorn kind of note to it. And it actually has like a decent popcorn texture too. It doesn't taste like burnt or almost burnt like you can sometimes get with some of those flavors. It just tastes like a straight ahead, like drier popcorn. And then it has a decent, like drier popcorn texture to it. There is quite a bit of sweetness there. It doesn't go, just by itself, it doesn't go like right off the bat into straight kettle corn, but you can definitely catch that there's some sweetness in there. As you start to sort of crank up the percentage on it, it gets a little bit more caramely. I'd say around like 3%. You're already looking at something that feels like a softer caramel, like caramel, a softer caramel, like Capella's or like the caramel candies from TPA or Flavor West. It has that kind of soft caramel as opposed to like the normal Flavorah caramel, which is kind of a drier, grittier caramelized sugar note, or Flavor Arts caramel, which is largely the same. Um, it doesn't really dominate though. It kind of just like sits around those drier popcorn notes. There is a little bit of butteriness to this. Down at like 1%, I'm not really getting too much of it, but as you start to like crank it up higher than that, like 3%, you do start to notice like a little bit of a butyric acid kind of taste to it and just a little bit of cheesiness. So I'm testing this after a week of steeping, and that's one of those notes that may steep out if you give it even more time. Which buyer caveat emptor with that. But generally, you can get a pretty accurate description of a flavor at a week for at least a solo flavor that isn't like some sort of weird tobacco. Uh, so overall, I think this does taste like popcorn. I don't find the sweetness off putting. I don't think it goes all the way into kettle corn. The butter note is pretty good as long as you keep this underneath like 2%. It doesn't really sort of get cheesy until you crank it up higher than that. Uh, and the texture is very accurate to popcorn. It has a lot of texture to it. It's just kind of dry, and it isn't really like a heavy, full, aggressive flavor. So I found in some concentrates, I don't know, I've been calling it the Rice Krispie syndrome, basically. In some concentrates, when you have a lot of texture and you don't have a lot of flavor, it can tend to get a little bit cardboardy. And I feel like the softer caramel note is one of those things that tends to exacerbate that. So I am getting a little bit of like a little bit of a cardboardy taste off this, um, which again probably accurate to the profile. I mean, if that's popcorn is kind of cardboardy, especially especially if you don't throw a bunch of butter and salt on it. Uh, but while I feel like this is accurate to popcorn and I kind of like the accents around it, I think my biggest issue with it is it's going to be a little bit interesting to mix with. I think if you wanted something like a single flavor popcorn mix, or you wanted um, something more like a kettle corn, bringing in like a little bit more caramel, it would be good for that because it definitely tastes like popcorn, and it has some of the texture. I think where you're going to run into some problems is kind of accenting this or using it as an accent because of the way that flavor works, that sort of lighter but still fluffy textured flavor is going to get lost in a lot of things if you're trying to like build on it. And then if you wanted to use this as an accent, I feel like it doesn't quite have the presence to kind of cut through some other flavors. The actual flavor here kind of reminds me of like the sweetened coating on something like Corn Pops, the cereal, which sounds like a great idea for accenting, but you've kind of got to contend in that space. You kind of got to contend with Cereal 27 by Cap, which has that same kind of corn note, and it's a little bit more aggressive and a little bit better as an accent. So it's going to be interesting. I'm really interested to see what people do with this. I think it might be another case where I'm just not as good of a mixer to that as I need to be to sort of figure out what to do with this. But yeah, it tastes like popcorn. It tastes like a light kettle corn type of popcorn. I would keep it around 1.5%, maybe 2% if you're using it as a primary note, just because I feel like that sort of butyric cheesy note is a little bit much at higher percentages. And you've got to watch your texture and watch your accents with it. But yeah, I'm interested to see what people do with this one. So the next flavor that I have is their graham cracker. So right off the bat, I don't get any kind of cinnamon note from it, which may or may not be a good thing depending on your cinnamon preferences. But yeah, it's definitely like more of just like a straight up, maybe like honey graham kind of flavor. Um, this one again feels a little bit top heavy, and a little dry, without necessarily being like crispy like you'd expect for a graham cracker. Like it feels like it needs just a little bit more acetylpyrazine or something to kind of get going and get some of that snap that you expect from a graham cracker concentrate. Uh, Seems to be just a little bit of a heavy hand with the vanilla. I'm testing it here at about 2%. I think as you start to sort of bump up to like 4 or 5%, you almost get like oatmeal cookie icing note from the vanilla. So it's a little strong on the vanilla. But yeah, in general, it's a good graham cracker top note if you don't want cinnamon. Um, but it feels like you really need something to sort of emulate that snap in the base if you wanted to take it into more of like a fuller graham cracker flavor. Um, in terms of using it, generally, if you have a graham cracker, you aren't just after the top notes. This seems a lot more like the top notes from a graham cracker without the body. And for some flavors, that can be useful when you want to put in very very targeted accents on things. But in a lot of the places you're going to be putting a graham cracker in, you kind of want that fuller body if you want to play it against something and it needs to stand up and be like a distinct graham cracker flavor, or if you're doing the thing where you're adding graham cracker to a cream or a custard, you generally want that kind of texture in there. So if you're using this, I think you'll get the top notes a lot clearer than you'll get the actual base. So the big question with this, people have strong opinions about their graham crackers. Wars have been fought and friends have been lost based on what graham cracker you choose. So I did go back just before this test and kind of refresh myself a little bit with some of the available graham crackers. Um, so this doesn't have much to do with Capella's graham cracker, which is probably my favorite graham cracker, just because it's a bit heavier, a bit richer, has a little bit of a snap to it, and it does have a cinnamon note that I actually really like in there. Um, this again, lighter, doesn't have the cinnamon note, doesn't quite have the snap, doesn't really seem all that comparable. So TPA's graham cracker clear is again a little bit richer, has a little bit more of a buttery note. Some people swear there's a spice note in there. I don't really get one, but I could see theoretically how people could. I don't know. I don't get a distinct like cinnamon and sugar thing. It does have a little bit of a gritty texture. Sort of that grit and that butter works really well to kind of blend, and it tends to show up really well in mixes. Uh, but I'd say that the Flavorah is sort of lighter, drier. Instead of being like gritty like a graham cracker, the Flavorah can get like a little bit of like a powdery edge to it just because of that dryness. Uh, the thing it reminds me the most of is Flavor West Graham Cracker. And Flavor West Graham Cracker, I like okay. Um, Again, it's drier and it's a little bit lighter flavor than the other ones. Uh, no spice note to it. It does have that same kind of sort of heavy hand with the vanilla that I'm finding the Flavorah does. But with the Flavor West, that vanilla ends up tasting a little bit frosting ish and plasticky to me. Um, the Flavorah version kind of reminds me of Flavor West, but with a better vanilla note and maybe just a tad less intense. So in terms of where you're gonna use the Flavorah, specifically where you wouldn't want to use the other ones, really, if you don't like cinnamon and you don't like the TPA version because of the butter, because that can get a little bit weird, and Flavor West tastes plasticky to you like it does to me, it seems like a pretty good use case for this graham cracker. Percentage wise, since it's so top heavy, you can kind of just crank up the percentage if you really need to. Um, I've tried this up around 4 or 5%, and honestly, there's nothing offensive or weird about it. It just doesn't quite fill in the base. I think that you will be able to get most of what you need, maybe around 3%, maybe 4% if you're pushing it. For an accent for those graham cracker top notes, I'm thinking something more like 2% in the usage. But yeah, not a bad flavor. I just feel like there's going to be some issues that pop up trying to mix with it and using it like you would the other graham crackers. So, the last flavor for today, I have Flavorah's new Vanilla Bean. And this is really interesting. So, tasting this solo, which I'm about to do, there doesn't feel like there's a lot of flavor here, which is interesting. And it kind of threw me for a loop at first. You know, generally when I'm tasting a vanilla, most of them have like a thicker base attached to them, like they have some sort of cream base, or they have like a heavier like extract note or something, like something to kind of let that vanilla flavor sort of latch onto. And sort of what I found is this isn't really cross comparable to a lot of other vanillas. More than anything else, it ends up working a lot like vanillin, just like straight ethyl vanillin, where it's very light and it does more to sort of pick up on existing vanilla notes in other things. And it kind of has that weird, like sparkling, exotic vanilla flavor. It just kind of lays that in the top notes in most of the places where it needs to go. But see, in tasting that solo, you don't really get that. It feels a little thin and weird, and maybe you get a hint of vanilla. But where it really starts to come alive is where you start mixing it, which again is sort of the case with using vanillin. So here I have it mixed with Innerware's custard, which I like at 1.5%. The vanilla bean here is mixed at 1%. So Innerware's custard, sort of a heavier, rich, eggy custard. It does have some vanilla in there, but it's a very like warm sort of bakery vanilla. So here with the additional vanilla bean, it really livens up that vanilla. It adds like a very realistic, sort of vaguely spicy, dark vanilla note to the existing vanilla note in the custard there already. It's really interesting actually, and it's a very very accurate vanilla bean flavor. So like when you actually cook custards, generally what I do is I'll take a vanilla bean, split it, pull the pulp out, and then like actually cook the custard with the vanilla bean husk and the pulp in there. And this vanilla bean is doing a lot of the same kind of thing. It's adding in those sort of rich, spicy, vaguely earthy vanilla bean notes on top of an existing concentrate, which is pretty cool. I think it's going to make it a little interesting to use, honestly. So using this, If you put it on top of other creams or milkshake bases or ice creams or something, it's going to really sort of richen those. Richen? I don't think that's a word, but it's going to really enhance those kind of vanilla flavors and sort of pull it more from like that sort of one note frosting vanilla that you can get in a lot of places into something that tastes a lot more real and nuanced. Uh, it's also going to open up some applications for like textured bakeries and tobaccos where you don't necessarily want to start adding in a bunch of cream base to get those vanilla notes. I think with this, you can go ahead and add some of this in. And instead of like making the entire mix soggy, it's just going to give you some really nice sort of dry, spicy vanilla notes on top of things. My big question, so after figuring out that it kind of works a lot like vanillin, was what's the difference between this and just straight vanillin, which is obviously cheap as hell and you can get it anywhere. So vanillin for me tends to do the same thing. It brightens vanilla flavors, but it kind of brightens them up to like a vanilla soft serve kind of flavor. This seems to have a lot more nuance, and while they're sort of working similarly, I am really enjoying sort of the depth and the nuance that this is bringing to it. So just based on some cursory testing, it seems like it's fairly potent when you're actually mixing it. I would probably recommend using this like you would ethyl vanillin. Around like 0.25 to 0.75%. I'm not thinking you're going to need a lot of it, but it's really going to perk up those vanillas and it's really going to help sort of maintain the texture of juices that you already have sort of nailed that you just want some extra vanilla to. So I hope that was helpful. I'm going to have more of these videos coming up. I believe there is 22 more flavors coming out. So I've got content for a while. But thank you for watching. I'll catch you later.